Do you think people change? Have you ever seen them change? Many people are already skeptical about the idea that people change. This is because they have all had experiences where they tried to change the wrongdoings of people around them, only to get hurt and suffer losses instead of changing. Do people really not change? Today we will learn about 9 types of people with whom you must cut ties. First, they break small promises. If we look around us, there are people who break small promises while watching the other person's reaction at first. They gradually watch the other person's reaction and eventually break bigger promises. They are especially bad at keeping promises related to money. They say that they won't get into details with their friends and don't think it's a big deal to break a promise. People who hear this are afraid of looking confident and sometimes endure it for their image. However, if you endure it like this, the other person will act more freely. Of course, they don't keep promises about time. They try to do things their own way. In relationships, promises are often changed, and things that need to be done are postponed because of one person like this. In relationships, even small promises should never be neglected. How can someone who can't keep small promises, big promises? One of the main characteristics of people who are unreliable is that they often break small promises. They mostly don't keep small promises or change their minds easily. You should never do money transactions with them. They don't pay back loans or borrowed money on the promised date or try to avoid paying expenses that need to be shared in relationships. They don't respect other people's efforts, money, and time, and they don't consider the other person's position or feeling. This makes them unbearable. In relationships with these people, you will definitely suffer emotionally and materially. You should definitely keep your distance. People like this don't change easily. The second is that they emphasize that they know a lot of people. One of the ways to never fail in life is to be careful of people who constantly brag about being close to famous people. People who say this are not actually close to famous people, and even if they do, they are unlikely to have a close relationship. I know someone who will help me out, so tell me if you need to. They repeat the same thing over and over again, but it never happened. Can't believe it. It is difficult. In reality, if you try to meet the person they mentioned, they will refuse you with any excuse. They try to prove themselves by showing pictures or business cards taken with famous people, but anyone can get this. This behavior is an attempt to borrow external power to hide their shortcomings. They try to increase their value through lies or exaggerated stories. This is because they lack real ability, so believing what they say is the same as losing their value. They tend to deceive others for their own benefit. That is why it is important to look at the person's actual actions and abilities instead of their connections when judging a person. It is better to look at actual actions rather than their appearance or words. People who try to be recognized for their efforts and sincerity are naturally more trustworthy than those who try to elevate themselves by borrowing the fame of others. The third is that they always forget what they said. Sometimes people forget what they said. That does not mean that they are unconditionally trustworthy. There are many times when they do not remember what they said because they are busy or have amnesia. However, if this happens repeatedly, you should be careful. Sometimes they forget words that are disadvantageous to them, or they may intentionally try not to remember them. However, the real problem is irresponsible behavior. It is naturally difficult to build trust with someone who forgets important promises or denies what they said. Responsible people take responsibility for their action and try to solve problems when they arise. People who are difficult to trust often go back on their words or confuse others. They try to avoid their responsibilities by lying or distorting the facts. Such behavior makes others lose trust and ultimately has a negative impact on interpersonal relationships. People who believe in responsibility keep their words and try to solve problems when they arise. On the other hand, irresponsible people often go back on their words, lie, or distort the facts to avoid their responsibilities. You should never get close to such people. When judging people, you should look at their actions as well as their words. Trust is not just words, but action. What is important to people is responsibility and sincerity. The fourth personality is the changeable personality. Many people think that the line between good and bad people is clear. However, in reality, this line is blurred. In particular, there are people around us who approach others for their own benefit, and then suddenly turn cold when the usefulness disappears. They view human relationships solely from the perspective of benefits and losses, not from the emotions between people. The length of a relationship with the other person depends on what benefits it brings to them and how long the benefits last. Sometimes, people pretend to be nice for their own benefit and then approach others, but the usefulness of the other person disappears. Sometimes you meet people who turn away so coldly that it's scary. Especially mean and clever people repeat this pattern, turning away coldly and then pretending to be nice again when they see someone they can use again. Ordinary people feel sorry, ashamed, and guilty when they deceive or use someone. But these mean and clever people don't even feel sorry. To them, the act of using someone is not a problem at all. And at that time, they just think it was their mistake. They are insensitive to the consequences or the other person's feelings. These people are the ones who only hurt others in relationships, so you should avoid them at all costs. These people ignore or do not consider the other person's feelings or thoughts important, so they are hardly affected by the other person's negative reactions and do not react sensitively. The biggest characteristic of bad and clever people seen here is that they are inconsistent. They do not care that their actions themselves are self-contradictory. Clever people change their words and actions depending on the situation for their own benefit. Therefore, if someone uses you, leaves, and then tries to come back, never accept them. Keep in mind that it is difficult once, but very easy twice, and apply it to your relationships. Fifth, they are irresponsible. Irresponsible behavior is interpersonal. It is one of the important characteristics that causes problems in all aspects of relationships. This irresponsibility is even more evident in the actions of those who hide behind the mask of cleverness. Irresponsibility refers to an attitude of ignoring the consequences of one's actions or decisions, or trying to escape responsibility for them. Blaming others for one's mistakes or failures is their behavior. For example, even when one breaks a promise or is negligent and causes harm to others, there are many cases where one does not admit one's mistakes but instead shifts the responsibility to the other person. It is very common to not admit one's mistakes but to avoid responsibility by lying or making excuses, and to abandon trust or promises depending on the situation. Irresponsibility can be broadly divided into two types. One is due to simple ignorance. These people admit their mistakes and try not to repeat the same mistakes. The other is those who act strategically irresponsibly. These people try to use others for their own benefit. This strategic irresponsibility is actually another name for cleverness, and it is an act that pursues only one's own benefit without caring about the harm to others. This is an action that should never be tolerated in human relationships. Irresponsible behavior ultimately harms not only oneself, but also others, and by avoiding responsibility for one's actions, one loses trust. Irresponsible behavior toward others ultimately leads to isolation in human relationships, and those who continue to act irresponsibly do not consider the long-term consequences of their action. This is not simply ignorance, but a deliberate choice to use others for their own benefit. Historically, irresponsible behavior has been one of the main causes of destroying trust and ruining relationships between people. Even in the old days when social contracts and moral responsibility were emphasized, some people made irresponsible choices for their own benefit. Such behavior went beyond mere personal problems and resulted in weakening the moral foundation of the entire society. Since it is difficult to take responsibility and easy to avoid responsibility, people are often tempted to be irresponsible. However, we must remember the lessons of the past and escape the temptation of irresponsible behavior and live a responsible life for both ourselves and others. Sixth, they take others' kindness as a right. They increasingly take the goodwill of those who treat them as their escorts for granted, and act as if it were their right to enjoy it. These people tend to approach kind people, or those who try to be polite. Even people who were around them from the beginning often change to this attitude over time. Because they can't stop. In fact, they can't say anything. They often continue to be nice to others because they feel guilty that it's rude not to do so. If this situation continues, even among good people, immature ones will take the other person's good intentions for granted. This is a big problem for those who think that being nice to them is their right. But there are also problems for those who can't stop being nice. One of them is that they can't stop for themselves. In fact, stopping is not an easy decision for these people. However, waiting until the other person realizes that they have learned a bad behavior can lead to bad consequences, both themselves and the other person. I can get exhausted and collapse, and the other person can explode with anger due to resentment. So, when you first see the signs, you should stop or distance yourself and ask for help in return. And make them accept being nice to you is not a given. If it's a long-term relationship, you should share your difficulty and feeling. It is good to ask the other person to change while talking dirty. The other person may be embarrassed by the sudden change and may get angry. They may say that they want you to do as you used to or express their difficulties by saying that the sudden change is too difficult. If you do as you used to, the other person will feel comfortable, but it is difficult to accept this kind of compromise. In human relationships with people who think that, if you do it well, it is a right, it is necessary to set clear boundaries in order to deal with them. When showing from the beginning, do it to a certain extent so as not to cross the line. Also, when the other person starts to take help for granted, it is important to point it out and correct it. This should make the other person reflect on his or her behavior. Seventh, cut off the other person. If you take your words lightly or cut off in the middle of a conversation, you will not feel good. Everyone has self-consciousness. So no matter who you are, you think that you are important, but if you cut off someone else, you hurt the other person's self-consciousness. The other person will feel neglected, and the person who cuts off your words will be rude. Of course, even if you cut off the other person because you think you know what he or she is going to say, and he or she always says the same thing, this behavior is just self-centered thinking. Because this behavior prevents you from concluding what the other person is going to say. It shows arrogance and rudeness that takes away the initiative in the conversation. Therefore, the other person will immediately notice that it is an act of putting themselves down and will feel bad. If you really don't have time, it is understandable if you ask for understanding. But if you suddenly cut off the conversation without asking for understanding or say sorry in a perfunctory manner, and immediately cut off the conversation, it is an act that is quite infinite and unpleasant, regardless of whether the other person is close or not. If you cut off the other person in the middle of their conversation, or only talk about yourself, reasons such as different opinions or not wanting to hear, It means that what the other person says is worthless, and this attitude is the same as wanting to fight. People who are recognized as having a good personality never do such rude behavior. They try to listen to the other person without interrupting them. In most human relationships, you can start by receiving more than a little bit of attention just by listening well. People who listen well can easily build relationships. 8th, interfering with the other person. A person who interferes with the other person's actions or thoughts and calls them names is not interested in other people's goals or dreams, and only thinks about their own goals and dreams. The other person is naturally offended because they think they are less important. The root of the behavior of trying to control is the arrogance that you are trying to control. These people think that they are very good and that others cannot keep up with them. But the world is wide, and there are many people, so there are many people who are better than them. So how can you try to control others, because you are so good? If you try to make others fit your standards, no matter how much you develop, you will only develop to the extent of your own capacity. The saying that you are a frog in a well is exactly like this. If a more excellent person sees this person, they will only try to distance themselves from the person's narrow-minded and arrogant thinking, and even people of a similar type who are not as excellent will all try to distance themselves from the arrogant attitude of these people. There are various opinions and various ways to wisely solve problems in the world. There are cases where people succeeded in business by using methods that others discouraged them from doing, and cases where they won the Nobel Prize by successfully experimenting with non-mainstream method. That is why there is a saying that there is no right answer in the world. Your own thoughts are not the right answer, but just one of many methods. Rather, the thoughts of the other person who is being interfered with may be a better method. That is why it is better to put aside the idea that only you are right in any case. If you put aside your arrogant thoughts for a moment and listen to the other person with an open mind, human relationships will be distinct. It can only get better. Unless I have a job where I have no choice but to be in a situation where I need to control or control is necessary for the safety of the other person, I should absolutely refrain from interfering with others according to my standards and my own thoughts. 9th, if you tolerate, I ignore you and take it lightly. There are people who ignore and take lightly the work of being tolerated. Such people have really learned poorly. Being patient is not weak. Sometimes, patience can be an expression of the ability to calmly analyze a situation and control one's emotion. In the long term, it is often wise to prevent damage and maintain relationship. Therefore, it is immature to misinterpret the behavior of people who tolerate and take them lightly. In fact, depending on the situation, there are cases where people tolerate because they are weak. However, treating them lightly and taking them lightly because they are weak is also immature and truly mean. This can be considered a truly unlearned behavior. The attitude of taking lightly those who tolerate ultimately means a lack of respect and understanding. This attitude can ultimately be harmful to oneself. Those who tolerate can feel their limits and explode at some point, which can lead to the breakdown of the relationship. It is important to have an attitude of respecting and understanding the work of being patient. Respect and understanding are the basis of all healthy human relationships. If we don't respect and understand each other, relationship won't last long. Therefore, we should recognize the inner strength of those who endure and be grateful for the patience they show. Relationships based on respect and understanding create deeper and more meaningful relationships. We learned about 9 types of people we must definitely cut ties with. Please leave your opinions about the wisdom we learned today in the comments. I will end the video here. Thank you for always watching. This is The Insightful Mindset.